Hi guys, welcome to this step-by-step tutorial of this gorgeous polar bear. I don't actually use any masking fluid in this tutorial, so it shows you a good alternative to masking fluid, and I use lots of yummy techniques in the background. So, shall we get started? For a full list of all the materials I'm using, the colours, alternative colours, and a link for the photograph which can be found in the description below. As you saw there, I mixed up some raw sienna, quite a dilute raw sienna with my size 8 brush. I'm getting a pinch of violet here. You can mix up ultramarine with a touch of pink. And I've got a tiny bit of raw sienna in there just to dull it a little bit. And I've added some phthalo blue. You can use Prussian blue, lots and lots of water as well. To make this really simple, and so it's not too scary, I'm just going to wet each sort of section. So I'm wetting his leg here to the right, his left leg, with my size 8 round brush, and then painting wet into wet the raw sienna. You can use yellow ochre as an alternative colour. It's a very pale colour. Mixing up a touch more raw sienna now, slightly creamy. You can see it's a little bit darker. And I'm adding some violet to that raw sienna, about 50-50, and painting that damp into wet. So there's not as much water in the paint, so it doesn't run as much when you paint it on the picture. So I'm painting that in the shadow areas, and it's a nice natural looking shadow colour. Adding a little bit more of the blue, the violet with the raw sienna now, just to make it slightly darker right at the top of his leg here. Using the tip of my brush and sort of cutting in to the polar bear's hair just above as well. So you've got that light against dark as well. So that's pretty much pushing that into dry paper there. So you get some lovely crisp, hard edges. If you lose the white of your paper, just use a paper towel, which is what I'm doing here, to get the light back. It's very easy to lose the white of the polar bear. You almost need to exaggerate it. If you want to make a white animal or object or flower look white, you almost have to leave more than what you can actually see. Otherwise, you're going to end up with a grey or a yellow polar bear. Even though they're not completely white, we're creating an illusion here. We're using artistic license. So you can see I'm using the same technique here, wetting his right leg with clean water, and then starting with the light colour, the raw sienna, and then using those slightly darker colours where I can see the dark is what I'm doing here, painting wet into wet, again sort of lifting off with the paper towel so it doesn't run too much, and then blending with a clean damp brush so you get a soft edge on that shadow, and then again cutting in to the hair just above there on his body. And I'm sort of still using that raw sienna, maybe a touch of violet, a touch of blue, changing the colours. So the shadow colours will always be kind of the violet with a touch of the raw sienna, maybe a little bit of blue, or you could use a touch of Paynes grey even. You can really experiment with these colours. What you don't want to do is go too dark, so you can resist that. You can always go and paint wet on dry later, darker shadow colours, so don't worry about that at the moment. You just want to build up these sort of light and medium tones, keeping lots and lots of light. Using the tip of my size 8 brush, cutting into the dry paper just above, so you've got that white hairs or fur coming down into that darker area there. So it's a really nice way of painting without using masking fluid to reserve and preserve the white of the paper. And I'm just blending here with a clean damp brush. So it's a lovely warm dark shadow colour here. So I'm using some ultramarine now, painting that into the violet and a little bit of the raw sienna as well, very dilute, and just painting this sort of cool colour. There's a lot of light coming from the left, so I'm painting some of those shadow colours on the right hand side and at the top of his legs as well. And sort of just working up to the body there, using that cool ultramarine with a little bit of the violet. And again, rinsing my brush, taking the excess water, damp brush off on a paper towel, and then blending. You don't want to take too much of the water, clean water off your brush, because sometimes what will happen is you won't be blending and softening, you'll be lifting. So you kind of need your brush sort of to be damp, and it's a good thing to practice. It's quite a nice technique. So I'm just working my way up on the body there, just to create that lovely soft dark colours cutting into the white fur. So I'm wetting his face now with my size 8 brush all over. So again, starting off with the raw sienna. So I've given a tint of that raw sienna here and there, You notice I've swapped to my size 4 brush because I want to be really careful with this Paynes grey mixed with a little bit of the Phthalo blue. And now I'm using the tip of the size 4 brush and just painting those dark marks on the side of his face, damp into damp. It's really important to have the brush damp. If it runs too much, you're just going to get a flat wash, a flat dark wash on the side of his face. So I'm just building up here, leaving lots of light gaps as well, painting sort of shadow around his eye and just working my way across the nose area and also the dark of the mouth as well. It's quite dark there. So I'm just mixing up here some of the Paynes grey, some of the Prussian blue or Phthalo blue, really kind of damp creamy paint, and I'm just painting his nose now. Now this area is dry, so if you have wet this area, dab it with your paper towel before you start painting. What I've done now is I've diluted my brush, taken the excess moisture off on the paper towel, and I'm just blending around the edges there, but also adding a little bit of light there so it's not completely one flat colour. And again, I'm just softening the mouth area and trying to use the tip of the brush to cut in to the hairs just above. And I will be using some white paint at the end as well to paint little white hairs over the mouth for that little bit of detail. So I'm using a sort of watered down Paynes grey with that Prussian blue colour just above the sort of nose area, the bridge of the nose, and just softening as well, just to kind of create a little bit more of a lighter grey colour, and sort of painting this wet on dry, but then painting, sort of dropping in a little bit damp into wet, some darker greys as well, using my size 4 round brush. So I'm painting the eye now, wet on dry, using the tip of my size 4 brush with that Paynes grey and the Prussian blue. And the eyes are very dark and they're very small, but they really do give impact straight away. It looks like a polar bear. So I'm quite pleased with that. And I'm just softening now with a clean damp brush just above the eye area. So remember, rinse your brush and take the excess off on the paper towel, but don't wipe it clean off the water. You want something there just to blend and smooth and soften. And all of that sort of shading, that soft shading around the eye really brings his face to life there. And I'm just taking my time with this very small but dark details. So adding a touch more Paynes grey here with the Prussian blue and adding damp into damp, some darker marks on the side of his face here, just painting these little soft dark details, adding a touch more dark to the eye as well. I'm adding a little bit more shadow to the sort of top of the nose area here, still using that size 4 brush, still using that same colour, the Paynes grey with the Prussian blue, and then softening and blending with a clean damp brush, just really working around this important area, adding a little bit more dark to that left eye. I've mixed a little bit of burnt sienna with the Paynes grey, and I'm painting his ear wet on dry with my size 4 brush, again cutting into the lighter areas to make it look like the hair is going over the dark of the ear there, and then blending this sort of outside of the ear there and using a touch of raw sienna as well, painting a little bit of the shadow of the other ear. It's obviously not as dark and it's on the other side, so you don't want to bring too much attention to it, but just paint a little bit of dark in there as well. Using a touch more of the raw sienna now and just painting some of the area around the ear and the top of the head wet on dry to create the illusion of fur on the polar bear, and around the eye area as well. So just building up some sort of light tonal values here, just using the raw sienna. You can add a touch of that violet as well, just to make it look a little bit sort of slightly darker. And I'm just sort of finessing here and painting. This area is pretty much dried out here, so painting wet on dry some of these sort of light tonal marks. So I'm wetting sort of this sort of large area of the back here. I'm going to keep the top of the polar bear's back completely white, so even though I'm actually wetting that area, I'm not going to paint in that area, but I don't want any hard edges, and I'm just painting some very dilute raw sienna, but leaving white gaps as well in the lower part of the body, but it just makes him look more 3D just by adding this, adding a touch on the top of his back and the top of his head here, working my way down and softening and blending with my size 8 brush. Remember, if you go up too far, because you can get carried away, I know I do it, just use a paper towel and lift off. Raw sienna or yellow ochre lift off really nicely, and I'm just softening and blending. Look at my palette, there's not really any paint on there, there's just these really subtle light colours. So I've got the Paynes grey and the burnt sienna watered down here, really pale, and painting that damp into wet there, but again softening and blending with a clean damp brush and softening the nose area as well. And it's great, actually, it's very freeing up, actually, not using any masking fluid. It's a great alternative, just painting around things, even very detailed things. So what I'm doing now is I'm mixing up some colours for the background. I'm using Paynes grey and Phthalo blue. Big puddle, make sure you've got plenty of paint, and then pretty much Paynes grey on its own, maybe with a smidge of the Phthalo blue, and I'm going to allow my painting to dry. Once the painting is dry, I'm using my large flat 1-inch brush. You can use a larger brush, make sure it's a soft head brush, and wet that background. This time I'm actually going to paint straight away. So I'm actually going to drop paint into a puddle and let it run, because you get some really exciting effects. So you're really kind of loading your brush and sort of touching the very wet puddly paper background here and letting it, see how it's running up, it's beautiful, and you get these lovely light marks as well, and it'll create some wonderful atmospheric effects. Now, one thing to look out for is you want to be able to cut into all those fine hair or the fur of the polar bear, so take your time. So I'm working my way around the top of the polar bear here. I've actually just using now, I've just put my brush into the water, and that's just water going into paint there. So you've got a lighter colour at the top. So I'm really varying these colours. Don't even worry about getting backgrounds. It all adds to the yummy textures. So just working my way around here really carefully. So as you can see here, I'm just dripping in this puddle. And I just love how watercolour moves. So it's just sort of drifting and drizzling that in with the tip of my brush. And if you have to keep loading to get more paint, do so. And I'm tilting here just to get that atmospheric effect. It gets some really lovely effects there. I think I might have a background forming there, but I'm not worried. Going in with creamy dark paint here, letting it all just travel. It's got a mind of its own, and I don't mind. It's so freeing up to do a kind of a sort of almost abstract-y background like this. That's why I love that photograph. So I've got some puddles to deal with, so I'm just tilting here, mainly to that right-hand side, and I've just got a few little white gaps there, so I'm just painting some damp paint in there. But you can see I'm tilting upwards and to the right, so trying to get all the paint to the top right-hand corner or just to the right-hand side. So just let it all run there and then collect it with a clean damp brush. So I'm using sea salt here. You can use table salt. So I'm being very generous here. I'm throwing loads of salt on, and the important thing to do with salt is make sure you allow it to dry naturally. It could take up to an hour. This is a very wet background. I'm going to wet the foreground. I'm keeping away from the top edge of the snow there so that the water doesn't run into the background. And I'm mixing up here some Paynes grey with that Prussian or Phthalo blue, cold blue. And I've also got a touch of pink as well with the raw sienna. So you've got some lovely warm colours. I'm just painting some shadows on the snow, damp into wet with my size 8 brush. It kind of grounds the polar bear as well and makes him look like he's sort of standing on the snow. He's not floating. So I'm painting some smaller, cooler marks here using the Paynes grey with a touch of the Ultramarine even, and I'm just blending. So I'm just painting damp into wet, slightly darker shadow colours here using the Paynes grey with a touch of that Phthalo blue, working damp into damp and blending, and also painting some of the negative dark marks or areas between the polar bear's legs using the tip of my size 8 brush there, and that's pretty much the Paynes grey with the Phthalo blue. and it's sort of a nice cool sort of dark colour, and it really does bring the lighter legs forward as well. And now I've added a little bit more dark here of the Paynes grey and the Phthalo blue, and just cutting into the toes and the feet there, working damp into wet there, and then blending that dark into the shadow colours there. I'm using my paper towel now just to lift off a little bit. It's a good way of getting back some of your light, but also sort of getting that softness of the snow as well. So I'm just doing that here and there with the paper towel. I didn't like this dark smudge on the side of the polar bear's face, so I'm just softening with my diluted stencil brush. And I'm using some creamy Paynes grey, painting damp into damp with my size 4 round brush there. And just adding a few little darks and details around the mouth area and on the nose. Now I wasn't entirely happy with this area of the mouth, so again I've lifted off with my stencil brush just to reshape that area. And I've left that in just to show you you can change things. And I find sometimes I'll lose my drawing a little bit and I get carried away with the painting and things change. So you can still lift off and work at your painting. So I'm painting wet on dry here with some Paynes grey diluted with a bit of burnt sienna. And I'm just sort of cutting in where the shadow is, but into the white of the polar bear's fur as well. So I've mixed up here some very creamy, literally straight from the tube, burnt sienna and Paynes grey, painting pretty much wet on dry with my size 4 brush, the dark of the claws. You can see how it really brings him to life here. I've just rinsed my brush there and I'm just softening some of those darks here, almost smudging them to create slightly lighter sort of tonal values just around those claws there. And I am actually just painting a touch of dark using the burnt sienna and the Paynes grey, a little bit more watered down, but just a little bit of dark just right underneath the feet there for a touch of shadow where it would be the darkest. So it really grounds him and it makes him look like he's standing on that snow. And then I'm blending that dark into the shadows of the snow with a clean damp brush. And I'm just painting a few darker marks just behind the polar bear here, sort of the footprints that he would have taken earlier. And just sort of darkening up now the legs using my size 8 round brush, and I'm using a very dilute, I've got a touch of pink in there, maybe a touch of burnt sienna, a little bit of Paynes grey, really watered down. So it's a very neutral sort of shadow colour. So it warms him up a little bit, and I want him to be warmer so he comes away from that background, that very cool background. So this is all wet on dry, but I want to keep the light at the back of the legs there. So I'm going to rinse my brush, take the excess water off, and then just soften towards the back of his legs there. So I'm just painting the shadows sort of on the belly area, working my way up to the back area. Remember, the most important area is the top of the back. You want to keep that white, and as you saw there, I lifted off with a paper towel, so have that on standby just to make sure that you don't lose your light. And I'm just painting here pretty much wet on dry using my size 8 brush, building up those shadow areas, but also keeping the light cutting into areas as well to show the characteristic fur of the polar bear as well. Using a little bit more of a darker colour here, painting damp into damp on the face, on the body, around the ears, etc. Building up those darks. Again, don't have it too dark. And I'm just softening again, making it look more natural with a clean damp brush. I felt I lost the shape of the mouth, so I'm using my pencil to redraw it rather than paint it, just to check it. And I felt it looked better, so I'm just using my size 4 brush, using some Paynes grey with a touch of burnt sienna, painting wet on dry the mouth area again. It's just a little bit narrower, it was a bit too wide. So it just shows you can change things still, even dark areas like this. So I'm just using the tip of the brush there just to create some more darks and details around the mouth. So just adding a little bit more of the raw sienna here around the face area, just to add a bit more warmth, using my size 4 brush, blending as I go. I felt I'd lost a light on the bridge of the nose there, so I've just used my little eradicator brush there to lift off the paint to get the light back there. You can use a small synthetic brush or a bristle hair brush to do the same if you lose your light. So I'm just painting a few more darks and details on the claw area and just underneath the feet using some Paynes grey mixed with burnt sienna. And I'm just using a watered down raw sienna, just painting it above the eye area here and then softening with a clean damp brush just to add a little bit more interest here, lifting off a little bit of light on the top of the nose area here and taking off the excess paint with my paper towel just to create a little bit more light. And I'm just softening some of these hard edges on the snow in the distance there, just here and there, hit and miss almost, just to make them look a little bit further away from the polar bear, just to create more depth in my painting. And I'm just painting now, wet on dry, some of the dark background just underneath the polar bear's chin. So I'm cutting in to the white fur as well. It just again brings him away from that background. I'm going to allow my painting to dry naturally to allow the salt to work. Once it's dry, you can brush off the salt using a paper towel. You can see it's all coming away there nicely. So I'm going to finish off now using some white gouache, working wet on dry with my size 4 brush. I'm giving the polar bears some sort of lighter hairs around the ears, around the eye area, just these really fine details that I couldn't really capture when I was cutting in, almost impossible for me anyway. But it's a really satisfying thing to do, to use white paint at the end of a picture. A few little white whiskers here over the mouth area as well, using the tip of my brush. So I'm just going to finish off with a spatter around the feet area and on the snow as well. Again, you don't have to do this, but I love finishing off with a spatter. It just stops me from overworking my watercolours. I know I've come to the end of my painting. So I'm just spattering around the edge of the snow there as well. And I've decided to spatter the background wet on dry and around the edge of the polar bear as well. I just thought it really does make it look wintry and like it's snowing, and there is a little bit of that in the photograph. So here is the finished painting. I've removed the washi tape and I am delighted with my first ever polar bear. Love that background, love the light to the top right, but the polar bear, and I love painting the fur and the detail as well. So I really hope you enjoyed this tutorial and that it inspires you to maybe paint a polar bear. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments section. And if you like to see more content like this, don't forget to subscribe to my channel where you'll get updates of my latest tutorials. And if you'd like to get access to my exclusive weekly tutorials, why not think about joining my Patreon membership? You can also get access to downloadable outline sketches, and you can cancel the membership anytime. Thank you so much for watching this tutorial. Happy polar bear painting. Bye for now.